All right, Cowboys Nation, let's get into it. This is the kind of news that doesn't feel good, especially when we were riding high on the idea of adding the 5th round compensatory picks to our draft board. Back around Thanksgiving, things looked very promising. There was a big development with Rico Dowell that seemed to put the Cowboys in a position to get those to 5th round comp picks. And when you look at how the compensatory pick chart works, it felt like a real win for the draft outlook. But now, with the season officially over and the updated numbers in, the reality is that Dallas is no longer in line to receive those to 5th round picks. So today we have to break down what happened, what went wrong, and what it means for the Cowboys heading into the draft. First, let's make sure everyone understands what compensatory picks actually are. These are extra draft selections the NFL awards to teams based on players leaving in free agency. It is not about players who were cut or traded, and those departures do not impact the compensatory pick formula. The system is designed so that if a team loses more or better free agents than it signs, it gets compensated with additional draft capital. Over the Cap does a great job of estimating the formula the league uses, but the NFL keeps the full details pretty private. The main factors in the formula are the annual value of the contract, known as the AP, and the percentage of snaps the player actually plays. That snap count is crucial because if a player is injured or simply does not get on the field much, it reduces the value of the comp pick. Over the years, the NFL has tightened up loopholes like cutting and re-signing players, so the system is less easily manipulated than it used to be. Still, there is some margin for error in projections, especially for those players on the edge of qualifying. That is why we always say these projections are good, but not perfect. Back in November, the projections showed the Cowboys were set to receive multiple compensatory picks, but also had a few that would cancel out with outgoing picks. The list included a 5th round comp pick for DeMarcus Lawrence, a 5th round comp pick for Jordan Lewis, and several 6th round compensatory picks for Brandon Cook, Chance Goulston, Chuma Dogba, and Rico Dowell. On the other side, the Cowboys were projected to lose compensatory picks for players like Dante Fowler, Solomon Thomas, Robert Jones, and Javonte Williams, which would cancel out some of the gains. When you put it all together, it looked like Dallas would net to 5th round comp picks. That was the big takeaway and why so many people got excited. Rico Dowell's strong performance in the second half of the season pushed him over the threshold to qualify, and that allowed the Cowboys to avoid having one of those 5th rounders canceled out. If that had happened, it would have been a much less favorable outcome. But the projections at the time showed the 5th rounders for Lawrence and Lewis. Unfortunately, those projections have changed, and the big reason is Jordan Lewis. Over the Cap's updated numbers now show that Jordan Lewis no longer qualifies as a 5th round comp pick. Instead, he is now projected as a 6th round comp pick. And the reason is not complicated. It is simply bad luck and some cruel timing that seems to haunt the Cowboys every year. Jordan Lewis suffered a season-ending foot injury in Week 16, and he had already missed for games earlier in the year due to a neck injury. Even though he had a strong season overall and played very well in Jacksonville, his snap count dropped significantly. The final tally shows he played only about 55.8% of the snaps, and that was enough to push him below the 5th round cutoff. The difference between a 5th round and 6th round comp pick for Lewis is just about 3% in snap percentage. That is all it took to cost the Cowboys a 5th round pick based on these projections. This is where the system can feel especially harsh because 3% is such a small margin. It is the kind of thing that feels almost unfair, but the NFL's formula is what it is. The projections are not set in stone either, so there is still a possibility that the NFL's actual calculation could differ slightly from what Over the Cap is currently showing. Sometimes the league's numbers end up being a bit different, and there have been cases where a player gets bumped up or down compared to the projections. So, while the current outlook is not great, there is still a small window for adjustment. We will have to wait and see when the official compensatory picks are announced, typically right before the start of free agency in March. The Cowboys report will have the full breakdown when that happens, so make sure you are following for the update. Even though the 5th round comp pick for Jordan Lewis is now a 6th, the other compensatory picks are still projected to be what they were. DeMarcus Lawrence remains a 5th round pick, and the 6th round picks for Brandon Cook and Rico Dowell remain in place. In fact, Rico Dowell even moved up to a 6th round comp pick. which is not a big change in the grand scheme of things. Chance Gulston remains a 6th-round cancellation, and Chuma Dogba is still a 7th-round cancellation. The overall result is that the Cowboys are now set to receive 1 5th-round comp pick instead of 2. Again, this is based on projections, and there is always the chance the final numbers could shift slightly. But right now the outlook is clear. One potential wrinkle that could still change things involves Robert Jones. His situation is interesting because it could impact whether the Cowboys get an additional comp pick or not, even though it would not necessarily net them a 5th-rounder. Jones signed a 1-year deal worth $3.75 million, but he did not play at all due to a neck injury. Most of his deal, about $3 million, was base salary and signing bonus, which was paid out regardless. The remaining $750,000 was tied to per-game roster bonuses. And because he did not play, it is likely that those bonuses were not paid. If those incentives are not counted in the compensatory pick calculation, it could move Jones's contract just outside the qualifying range. That would mean that the compensatory pick the Cowboys were expected to lose for him might not cancel out one of the other gains. In other words, it could mean that the Cowboys might still end up with an extra pick somewhere in the late rounds. It is a small chance, but it is one of the few remaining possibilities that could change the final compensatory pick outcome. We will have to see how the NFL ultimately treats those kinds of incentives, because sometimes they do count them and sometimes they do not. It is one of those gray areas that can be the difference between a team getting another draft asset or not. But beyond that, the other players on the edge of qualifying include names like Cooper Rush, who did not qualify for a comp pick in the projections initially. His snap count was listed at 0%, which was clearly incorrect, and it was later updated to around 11%. Still, that is not enough to qualify, and he remains outside the compensatory pick range. There were a handful of other players who were right on the edge, but did not quite meet the threshold. Unless the NFL's math differs from over-the-cap's calculations, it seems unlikely that any of those players will end up counting for the Cowboys. That being said, even with the disappointment of losing one of those 5th-round picks, the draft still has the potential to be a huge win for Dallas. The Cowboys still have the 1st-round selections, and that alone gives them a chance to build a strong class that can make an immediate impact. The difference between one extra 5th-round pick and 2 is not negligible, but it does not change the fact that Dallas has the opportunity to come away from the draft with some real game changers. The key now is to stay flexible, to watch how the compensatory picks are officially announced, and to adjust expectations accordingly. The draft is still the biggest event on the calendar for Cowboys fans, and the team's front office will have plenty of opportunities to add talent and depth. If you are still excited about the draft and what the Cowboys can do with the 1st-round picks, let me know how confident you are in the comments. Give me a rating from 1 to 10 and tell me what you think the Cowboys should prioritize. Are they going to go offense, defense, or take the best player available regardless of position? There are so many directions they could go, and the compensatory pick situation only adds another layer to the strategy, no matter what. The draft will be fascinating to watch, and the Cowboys are still in a position to shape their future in a big way. Absolutely. Cowboys Nation, let's keep going with the compensatory pick situation and what it means for Dallas as the draft approaches. The one thing that can still swing this in the Cowboys' favor is if the NFL's final calculations differ even slightly from what Over the Cap has projected. Sometimes those projections are off, because the league counts certain contract components differently, and incentives are one of the biggest examples of that for players like Robert Jones, who had a significant portion of his deal tied to per-game roster bonuses. The question becomes whether those bonuses are counted as part of the contract value, even if they were never earned. In theory, the NFL could decide that those incentives were likely to be paid, and therefore include them in the calculation. Or they could treat them as non-guaranteed and not count them. That difference alone could be enough to move a player from the qualifying range to outside it. And that would change which compensatory picks get canceled out. What makes this even more frustrating is that it is not just about one player. The compensatory pick formula is a delicate balance of multiple factors, and a small change in one player's qualifying status can ripple through the entire equation. For example, if Robert Jones ends up not qualifying, then the compensatory pick for Chuma Dogba would no longer be canceled out. That would mean the Cowboys would retain that pick. and it could potentially give them a third compensatory selection in the later rounds. It is the kind of outcome that could still make this whole situation feel like a win, even if the 5th round comp pick for Jordan Lewis is lost. But again, this is all dependent on how the NFL interprets the contract details. And we won't know until the league officially announces the compensatory picks. Another angle to consider is that the compensatory pick system is not always perfectly aligned with the real impact a player has on the field. There are players who contribute significantly to a team, but do not generate the kind of contract value or snap percentage that would qualify them for a compensatory pick. That can be a bit of a shame because it means teams sometimes lose players who were important pieces, but the league does not reward them with draft compensation. In the Cowboys' case, there were a few players who just missed the cut, and that is part of why the projections have ended up where they are. Cooper Rush is one example. He signed a 1-year deal, and at first it looked like he might be in the running. But his snap count and contract value were not enough to push him over the threshold. Trey Lance is another example of a player who had a deal that sounded bigger than it actually was, because a lot of the reported value was tied to incentives that were not met. It is a common theme every year, and it is something that makes the compensatory pick process feel like a guessing game until the final numbers are revealed for Cowboys fans. The biggest takeaway is that the compensatory picks are not a guaranteed thing until they are officially announced. Projections can change, and sometimes they change in ways that are painful. In this case, the Cowboys were hit by the reality of snap counts and injury setbacks, and that has shifted the outlook from the 5th round picks to 1. It is a disappointing outcome, especially when you consider how close Jordan Lewis was to maintaining that 5th round status. Just 3% of snap percentage is all that separated him from keeping that 5th round comp pick. That is the kind of margin that feels almost cruel because it is so small and out of the team's control. Once the season is over, injuries happen and players miss time, and the compensatory system does not make exceptions for that. It just treats the numbers as they are, and in this case the numbers did not fall in the Cowboys' favor. Despite that, there is still plenty of reason to feel optimistic about the Cowboys' draft outlook. Even with one fewer compensatory pick, the team still has significant draft capital, including the first-round selections that can be used to target impact players. The draft is where the Cowboys can address key needs and bring in talent that fits the identity of the team. Whether they decide to prioritize the offensive line, reinforce the secondary, or add playmakers to the offense, the options are there. The compensatory pick situation might have changed the number of selections, but it does not change the fact that the Cowboys have a strong position in the draft to add young talent. Before we roll on, subscribe to Cowboys Wire News, drop a like, and turn on the bell. Your support keeps the Dallas Cowboys updates coming. Tell us what you think in the comments. The mere possibility of Maxx Crosby wearing a Dallas Cowboys uniform is already sending shockwaves through league circles, even before anything becomes official. Around the NFL, whispers are growing louder that the Cowboys are closely monitoring a scenario in which one of the most relentless pass rushers of this generation could land in Texas. While nothing has been confirmed, the idea alone is enough to reshape expectations for Dallas defense. Crosby's reputation precedes him, known for his non-stop motor, physical edge, and leadership presence. He is widely regarded as a defender who changes the tone of a game without needing the spotlight. If the Cowboys were to secure his services, the immediate impact would likely be felt across the entire defensive front. Opposing offenses would be forced to rethink protection schemes, sliding help toward Crosby's side and leaving fewer resources to handle Dallas' other pass rushers inside the organization. The speculation points to a belief that the Cowboys are seeking more than incremental improvement. Adding a player like Crosby would signal an aggressive push, one aimed at turning pressure into a defining identity rather than a situational strength. His ability to collapse the pocket, set the edge against the run, and energize teammates could elevate a unit that already shows flashes of dominance. League executives privately suggest that even the rumor of Crosby joining Dallas alters how rivals prepare. It's not just about sacks or tackles for loss, but about the psychological effect of facing a defender who rarely takes a snap off. That kind of presence can shorten drives, force hurried decisions, and create opportunities for the secondary to thrive. For now, it remains speculation, the kind that thrives in quiet conversations and cautious optimism. Yet in a league where momentum often begins with bold ideas, the thought of Maxx Crosby reinforcing the Cowboys' defensive line feels less like fantasy and more like a calculated possibility, one that could redefine Dallas' defensive ceiling if it ever comes to pass. That's a wrap from Cowboys Wire News. For breaking Cowboys updates, subscribe, drop a like, and turn on the bell. Tell us your take in the comments.